Good afternoon, and welcome to the 7th Andrea and Charles Bronfman Lecture in Israeli Studies. My name is Emmanuel Adler, and I'm the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Professor of Israeli Studies at the University of Toronto. Our distinguished Bronfman lecturer today is Hebrew University Professor Shlomo Avineri, who will talk about Israel, Utopia, and reality 60 years on, a tour of force on Israel's past, present, and future. Previous lectures in this series were the former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, last year, the late Professor Aryeh Shachar, who we in Canada remember him very fondly, Professors Yaron Ezrahi, Naomi Chazan, Menachem Brinker, and I. Before introducing our illustrious guest and moving to the lecture and to the short question and answer period, I first would like to thank Professor Mary Gertler, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Professor David Cameron, Chair of Political Science Department, and Professor Jani Stein, Director of the Mank Center, for their support for Israeli Studies, in general and in fact for this lecture series in particular. I also would like to thank Jackie Vanterpool from the Dean's Office, and Rita O'Brien from the Political Science Department, and my wife Sylvie Adler, who helped so much to make this event possible. I also would like to thank Charles Bronfman for his invaluable help to Israeli Studies at the University of Toronto. His humble chair of Israeli Studies, he has made a major difference on Israeli Studies on this campus. I'm sure that had his schedule allowed him, Mr. Bronfman would have attended the lecture of our illustrious guest, whom I know holds in great esteem. I would like to add that we all remember Andrea Bronfman, who passed away a couple of years ago, and we thank her for her help to Israeli Studies here. I also would like to extend my congratulations to Mr. Bronfman, who just last week tied the knot to Bonnie, so mazal tov. If you would ask in Canada or the United States, who by far is the best political scientist in all times, people will throw all kinds of names, and in the end, there would be disagreement. Not in Israel. In Israel, academicians as well as the general public would categorically say Professor Shlomo Avineri, and they will add the Dean of Israeli Political Scientists. I think that if you would poll not only students but also his colleague as to whom is the most exciting Israeli political scientist they ever took classes with, they would unanimously say Professor Avineri. Actually, several Canadian professors who have taken a class with Professor Avineri before told me just in the past few weeks that they would like to take the magnificent course he's now giving at U of T these last couple of weeks. I also was lucky not only to attend some lectures by Professor Avineri, as I fully agree that he's a superb teacher and orator, but I also attend with him various, as they are called, track 2 and advisory forums, which included high officials from many countries. Let me tell you, the dynamics with Professor Avineri in the room is very similar to multilateral forums with the US delegate in the room. When they talk, everybody listens. Professor Avineri was born in Poland in 1933, and he has lived in Israel since 1939. He studied at the Hebrew University and the London School of Economics, and has held visiting appointments at Yale, Cornell, the University of California, Wesleyan University, City University of New York, Oxford, Australian National University, Central University in Budapest, the Cardozo School of Law in New York, and Northwestern University. At the Hebrew University, he held the positions of chair, the Department of Political Science, Dean of the Faculty of Social Science, and Director of the Institute for European Studies and of the Eshkol Research Institute. Professor Avineri was also a scholar, a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center, the Brookings Institutions, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Collegium Budapest, as well as the Institute of World Economics and International Relations in Moscow. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Applied Political Research, affiliated with the Munich University, and recurring visiting professor in the Nationalism Studies program at CEU in Budapest. During 1975 and 1977, Professor Avineri was Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the first government of Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha. He also headed the Israeli delegation to the UNESCO General Assembly, and in 1979 was member of the joint Egyptian-Israeli Commission that drafted the cultural and scientific agreement between the two countries. In 1996, Professor Avineri was awarded the Israel Prize, the country's highest civilian decoration. And in 2006, he received the Israeli Political Science Association Award for his contributions to the discipline in Israel and abroad. During 1990 and 92, he was a member of an international team of observers under the auspices of the National Democratic Institute for the first post-communist election in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, and Croatia, as well as other NDI international missions to Ukraine, Serbia, Kosovo, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Azerbaijan, Albania, Georgia. Professor Avineri's book, which covers a large variety of subjects and has been translated into many languages, include the social and political thought of Karl Marx, Israel and the Palestinians, Hegel's theory of the modern state, varieties of Marxism, the making of modern Zionism, Moses Hess, prophet and of communism and Zionism, Arlazarov, a political biography, communitarianism and individualism, and an historical introduction to the Hebrew edition of Theodor Herzl's diaries. His most recent publication is Herzl, an intellectual biography. Professor Avineri is member of the editorial boards of Political Theory, the Review of Politics, History of European Ideas, Constellations, Dialectic, Marx Engels Studying the Odes of Minerva, Eastern European Politics and Society, Eastern European Constitutional Review, Israel Studies, Journal of Israel History, and Problems of Philosophy in Moscow. In the past, he also served as in the editorial board of the American Political Science Review, and I thought I was busy. His op-ed articles have appeared in many of the top newspapers of the world, such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Die Zeit, Die Welt, Le Figaro, and Le Monde, and he now writes regularly for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. I would finally like to announce that at this very theater next Monday, between 3 and 5, an extraordinary intellectual roundtable will take place on the legacy of Isaiah Berlin, with the participation of Professor Avineri, Professor Ramin Yahabeglu, Professor Ronald Biener, and Professor Melissa Williams, the head of the Center of Ethics, who organized the event. Professor Avineri, Shlomo, we are delighted that you have agreed to give the 7th Andrea and Charles Bronfman Lecture in Israeli Studies. And we thank you and Vora, your wife, for your visit to the University of Toronto. Before I invite you to the podium, I just would like to say to the public, first of all, thank you for coming and joining us, and that Professor Avineri will entertain a few questions after the lecture. And please, when you ask your questions, if you can come to the microphone so your questions will be recorded. So Professor Avineri, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Professor Adler Emanuel, for this very generous and detailed and highly exaggerated introduction. One should never disagree with anything which is being said by an introducer, especially somebody as generous as Professor Adler, but he mentioned at the beginning there is something about which all Israelis agree, and it had to do with me or something like this. I mean, something that all Israelis agree, I've never met anything like that. Something must be, something must be wrong with that. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to be able to be with Dvorah, who is a lawyer in the family, so I should always take care, to be here at the University of Toronto and give this lecture. I'm particularly happy to be here in Toronto, which to many of us in Israel and all over the world has always been a symbol for an Ir Va'em Be'Israel, a metropolis. I mean, Ir Va'em really is the mother city, a metropolis in Israel, in a lecture connected with the Bronfman family, whose history in Toronto and relationship with Israel I do not have to elucidate because they are much better known here than I would be able to recount them. Let me start by an admission, which probably one should make. This is not the first time I'm giving a talk on the subject Israel, Utopia, and Reality. It's going to be a very different lecture from the one I'm going to refer to, but I used the title once. And it was some years ago. It was in 1986, and it happened to be in East Berlin, at that time still the capital of the German Democratic Republic, Communist East Germany. It so happened that for all kinds of reasons that have to do with my interest in Marxism and Hegel, I was invited to East Germany, and out of that invitation came out an invitation to give a talk at the Wilhelm Humboldt University in then East Berlin, unter den Linden, those of you who know Berlin, to give a talk about Israel. And it was a very complicated negotiation. There were no emails, even faxes didn't work with East Germany at that time. So it took some weeks to organize the context of the invitation. I insisted, first of all, I was very happy that Eastern University, Eastern German Communist University is inviting an Israeli and inviting me, not a typical invitee from Israel who usually was a member of the Israeli Communist Party. But I was told by the organizers that there should be something critical in the title. I said, I'm not going to talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I want to talk about Israel. But then they said, yes, but there should be something critical in the title. I mean, obviously, they had to get some kosher approval from somebody that they invited an Israeli, so there should be something critical in the title. So I came up with the idea of Israel, Utopia, and Reality. I mean, that something critical in the title is embedded. Not too critical, but somehow it is. Not too critical, but it's there. I mean, if you listen carefully, it is there. And I flew to West Berlin, crossed over by train and then by foot, Friedrichstraße, not the first time I was in East Berlin. I mean, this was some sort of crossing. And I was introduced very gently and very nicely by the dean of the faculty at Wilhelm Humboldt University. And he made the point that I'm the first Israeli to speak at this university. And then I very profusely thanked the university and the authorities. And I said, I'm very happy to be here speaking to you in Berlin, capital of the German Democratic Republic. This is political correctness in East Germany. You had to say Berlin, not East Berlin, which is West Cold War language. You had to say Berlin, Hauptstadt der DDR. Berlin, capital of the German Democratic Republic. Once I said Berlin, capital of the German Democratic Republic, everybody was relaxed. Everybody was happy. Obviously, the guy knows what he's talking about. He listens to us. Okay, everybody was very relaxed. And then I said, I'm also very happy to be able to talk to you about Utopia and Reality. Because you, here in Berlin, capital of the German Democratic Republic, must know quite a lot about the gap between Utopia and Reality, and everybody was already laughing, which suggested to me at that time, 1986, that things are beginning a little bit to loosen up. Now, that's as far as the first lecture. What I'd like to do today is something very different from what I did in East Berlin, and this was, more than 20 years ago. The way I'd like to approach the subject today is the following. Israel is not a unique country. I mean, every country is unique. Some countries are more unique than others. Obviously, Israel is more unique than other unique countries. But it is unique in one sense, that it is a society, a country, originated in an idea. It's a society based on a credo. It's a creedal society. And as such, it is in a very strange company. Israel is not a society that grew up out of historical, geographical realities like France or United Kingdom. I'm not going to say a word about Canada, so let's leave it aside for a moment. The United States was a society based on the ideal. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, there is a very clear anima amin, a very clear credo. At the roots of the American Republic. The Soviet Union, lehavdil, if anybody wants to say, the Soviet Union, lehavdil, also grew out of an idea. Israel grew out of an idea, the idea of Zionism. And the idea was propagated, described, written about, spoken about, if you wish, dreamt about, by the first Zionist thinkers and activists. And some of those writings are more interesting, some are less interesting, some are utterly boring, but that's the point. It is a state, a country based on an idea. And if a country is based on an idea, and as I said, there aren't many, United States, the Soviet Union, and some communist societies, not many others, you have an unusual opportunity of comparing the idea or the text which propagates the idea or determine the idea or have tried to describe or postulate the idea to compare them with the country, the society that grew out of that idea. And this is, of course, part of American political philosophy or legal philosophy, where it's always possible to compare American reality, for better or for worse, I'm not being judgmental about the United States, with the ideas of the Founding Fathers, or the way you interpret the ideas of the Founding Fathers. So we're getting deep already in the debates. What did they mean? Does it relate to us, etc., etc. The same can be done in Israel. And in the case of Israel, the juxtaposition of the idea with reality is perhaps more dramatic than in any other country, because, let me start with the Soviet Union and get it out of the way very quickly, because in the Soviet Union you could compare some of the emancipatory statements of Marx, the Soviet Stalinist constitutions of the 1930s, with their reality, and it was very clear that reality doesn't live up to any of the emancipatory and liberating promises of the original Marxian or communist project. United States may be more difficult, but also in the United States, what do you compare? You compare the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, or the debates in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to reality as it was then, later, and now. In the Israeli case, blessedly, as you know, we do not have a constitution, so you cannot compare constitutions that we do not have with Israeli reality, but we have something better. We have at least one, we have quite a number, but we have one utopian novel written by Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionists, who left us two books, both of them in a way very boring, but in very different ways, but very significant. The first boring book is A Jewish State, which is really a legal memorandum published 1896, calling and trying to legitimate the idea of a Jewish state. It's written as a legal memorandum, and therefore it's a little bit technical, and if somebody, I'm sure all of us have read it, but if you go back to it and read it again, you will find that some of it is really, really not very interesting. You understand what Herzl was trying to do. There are some quotable quotes there, but the volume itself reads like a lawyer's draft or lawyer's memorandum. The other book is a novel which Herzl published already when the Zionist organization, which he helped or initiated to come about, was there. The first Zionist Congress met 1897. In 1902, 1903, Herzl writes a novel called Alt Neuland, Old New Land. Some of you may remember that the motto is very 19th century, very Rousseauist, if you wish, or very Nietzschean. If you wish, it is not a fable, so it is part of human agency that can bring it about. And in it, Herzl depicts how a Jewish society would look in the year 1923, assuming that there will be a Jewish commonwealth or state in 1923. So he gave himself 20 years. This was written in 1902, published 1903, and he depicts the Old New Land in 1923. Now it is, I said, a utopian novel. Herzl is very much aware that he's writing a utopian novel, And therefore, he wants to make sure that people will not view it as a utopian novel, as something else. Because to write a utopian novel is very easy. A lot of utopian novels have been written mainly by utopian socialists in the 19th century. There is, of course, the classical Utopia, St. Thomas More's 1516 Utopia, no place, which gave the name to the genre. And the easiest thing is to write about a society the way you would like to see it. And that's one of the reasons why we use, in a little bit following Karl Marx, but not necessarily so, we use the word utopia as in a dismissive way. When somebody gives us a very good idea which looks lovely, we say, well, this is lovely, but you know, it's utopia. So Herzl was very much aware that if his book, which is a utopia, because it suggests a society as it will appear supposedly 20 years later, he's very much aware of the fact that if it will be viewed as a utopia, it will be also dismissed as, you know, the thinking, romantic, utopian, non-realistic thinking of somebody who's not really very serious. And therefore, at the beginning, at the foreword to the book, he very specifically says, this is not a utopia. This is almost like the famous painting, you know, this is not a pipe. This is not a utopia. This is a utopia. But he says, and this is clear, this is meant as a political program. This is not writing something about an ideal society that lives in cloud cuckoo land. This is an attempt in a form of a novel to present a political program, to popularize, so to speak, a political program. One of our colleagues at Tel Aviv University, who has been writing extensively on Zionism, Yosef Gorny, has coined the term regarding Herzl's Alt-Neuland, a realistic utopia. This may be an oxymoron, but I think it's clear what he was trying to say. Yes, this is an utopia, but the attempt is to depict something which is realizable, not something which is just ideal in an abstract sense. Now, what are the major ingredients of this utopia? When you read the volume, and I suggest to you now, again, I'm sure that some of you, most of you have read it sometime, go back and read it. And my recommendation is read it because it's extremely boring. And it's boring because being a utopian novel, there are a lot of speeches there where people explain what's happening. But it is historically a very unusual document because when reading it today, it is very clear when you read it today that you can put it up as a mirror to Israeli society and find Israeli society either living up to those ideas or wanting. And it depends on your judgment, and it depends on some issues, and I'm going to mention some of them. Now, the country which Herzl sees before him in 1923 is, first of all, modern. It is highly technological. There are even things like fax machines there. So not that Herzl invented the fax, but you have a machine there which is doing something similar towards fax. Not the internet. I mean, this is Al Gore. I mean, he invented the internet. So not Herzl. But you've got a highly, highly modern technological society, electrified trains, electricity, something, as I said, faxes, telephones, gramophones, very highly sophisticated, modern technological society, which is interesting, but neither here nor there. One of the most interesting things in the depiction of that society is the social order. Now, Herzl was not a socialist. There are plenty of socialist Zionists, not Herzl. Certainly he was not a revolutionary. Herzl was, if you wish, a typical liberal, bourgeois, middle-of-the-road, 19th century constitutional democrat, we could say. Certainly not a socialist. But the social order which Herzl posits for the future Jewish commonwealths is not an attempt to replicate in a Jewish Palestine, a Jewish commonwealth in the Middle East, the social order of the turn of the century in Europe. In other words, this is not another capitalist society or an improved capitalist society. This is a society where the land, the means of production are either owned by society at large or are based on a cooperative basis. Agriculture is cooperative. And in one of those long speeches and boring speeches that I mentioned, Herzl traces the origin of cooperative agricultural, consumer, and productive societies to what was happening in the mid-19th century in Great Britain. Herzl, being a political journalist with a good political historical education, knew what he was talking about. It's very, very clearly says that those cooperative societies are not based on biblical ideas or Talmudic ideas or rabbinical quotes. They are based on something which happened in Europe in the 19th century. And Herzl gives a name to his social order, using a term coming from utopian socialism, but giving it a very specific meaning. He calls it mutualism. Mutualism. And he says that our system is trying to learn from Europe. We are taking, or we are adopting from European capitalism the idea of freedom, individuality, and competition. And from socialism, we're taking the idea of solidarity and justice. So it is an amalgam. One could say a third way. I mean, the term is occupied, so I'm not going to use it. It's a third way between classical capitalism and classical state socialism. It is what we would call today a welfare state, or something like a welfare state. For example, the country does not have an army. I'll come back to it later. But all men and women, at the age of 18, have to do 2 years of what Herzl calls national service. What are they going to do in national service? They're going to be teachers, they're going to be sanitation workers, they're going to be nursing helpers in hospital, trying to do the things which Herzl, again, having a good understanding of, I wouldn't say human nature in general, but human modern society, knows that not all people would like to do this all their life. Not everybody would like to be a hospital nurse all their life, but you need that. And therefore, everybody will do it for 2 years. And Herzl says, by doing this service for 2 years, you're not going to have problems of manning those positions, which are not always easy to man. And you are repaying society for what society has already invested in you in education, because there's universal education until the age of 18. And you're going to prepay, so to speak, what society will eventually do to you or help you when you grow old and sick and infirm. This is a society based on universal suffrage. Men and women will have the right to vote and be elected. Now, this is written in 1903. In the Second Zionist Congress, 1898, the Zionist Congress decided to have women vote equally with men. This was 1898, and this is written 1903. Let me remind you, 1903, no country in the world yet had universal suffrage for men and women. It may come as a surprise that the first countries to introduce women's right to vote were some very strange countries like Finland at that time, a duchy, a semi-autonomous duchy of the Russian Empire, and later New Zealand. None of the major countries in the democratic liberal West rushed to introduce women's suffrage. In the case of Herzl, it is universal, men and women, and it comes up in the discussion and very clearly argued in language which we would today call feminist. Obviously, Herzl didn't use the term and may not have been aware of some of the implications, but he said, how can we not allow women who participate in the building of our new society to partake in the decision, etc., etc. This is point number 1. So mutualism. And the argument for mutualism for this mixed economy is that in order to be successful in nation building, you cannot, according to Herzl, do it relying exclusively on the forces of the market. I'm not sure I'm not going to say anything today about the forces of the market, whether you can build capitalism on the forces of the market. Not today is the wrong day to say anything about them. But in any case, when it comes to nation building, when you need solidarity, when you need the willingness of people to make, under certain circumstances, sacrifices, when you need people to be aware of mutuality, doing something for the other, you cannot do it on a basis of rational self-interest or whatever the ethos of capitalism and market society is. You have to combine the initiative of capitalism with the solidarity and justice of socialism. So this is the argument. And then there is another aspect of that society which we should be aware of. The establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, at the time, beginning of the 20th century, there were very few Jews in Palestine, where there is already a population there, an Arab population, is something which, of course, one of the major contention points around Zionism. I'm not going to go into it. But sometimes one hears, and one hears it in Arab propaganda, and I'll be very careful, I don't want to say a bad word about our Arab friends, but sometimes Arab propaganda is just lying. There is something which appears again and again in some Arab publications that says that Zionism called for a land, for a people without a land to come to a country without a people. That the country, according to the way this is depicted in some Arab propaganda, that the country is empty, there is no population, the Zionists never considered that there were Arabs or non-Jews in the country, Herzl was never aware of that. This is just not true. This is just a lie. Not only was Herzl aware, but the major political plot in the literary sense of the novel Alt-Neuland in the year 1923 deals with the issue of the rights of non-Jews in the Jewish state. Because one of the first things that Herzl suggests in 1923 to those people who come to visit the country, I'm not going to go into the literary framework of the book, people are visiting the country and being introduced to the country, is that not only are there Arabs there, but there are Arabs who are very prominent in this society. One of them appears very early in the novel. He is an engineer from Haifa. His name is Rashid Bey. Obviously, he speaks perfect English and German, and he's a graduate of a German university. I mean, we're talking about civilized people. I mean, this is Herzl with his 19th century Eurocentric view. I mean, here is an educated Arab who is one of the members of the directorate of the New Society, as this Alt-Neuland is being called. And he's being asked by some of the voyagers in 1923, didn't you, the Arabs, object to the Jews coming to the land? The answer today, when you read it, it makes you a little bit feel uncomfortable because it sounds like some of a Zionist Zionist version of the white man's burden. This Arab engineer said, well, we were very happy that the Jews came because they brought technology, they brought modernity, they brought health, they travel in the valley, Emek Israel, the valley of Jezreel, and the Arab engineer shows the visitors, you see, this is an Arab village, look how prosperous it was. We didn't really have water, people were really dying from all kinds of dysenteries and other sicknesses before the Jews came. This is, in a way, very naive. But it is liberal in the sense that here you've got a situation in which the Jews coming back to Palestine are aware that there is a local population and grant them equal rights, voting and being elected. Anybody who sometimes hears the comparison of Zionism and colonialism, etc., I'm not going to go into it, but I mean the French in Algeria did not give the Algerians the right to vote. The Brits in India did not give the Indians the right to vote. Herzl gives the Arabs in Palestine the right to vote and be elected. And not only that. At the time when the novel takes place, 1923, is a time of election. I mean, you can say every time in Israel is a time of election, but Not exactly, but we have more elections than we probably should have, once every 2 years rather than 4 years, but be this as it may. And what is the issue in the elections? 1923, it appears that a few years earlier, a new immigrant came to the country, a rabbi, Orthodox rabbi. His name, as given by Herzl, is Rabbi Dr. Geyer. Geyer is in German Walcher, so you realize this is not a good guy. And Herzl's literary imagination is sometimes not very creative. I mean, it's sometimes too transparent. And this guy, this rabbi comes to the country as a new immigrant and establishes a new party which calls for the disenfranchisement of all non-Jews in the country, because this is the country of the Jews and it belongs exclusively to the Jews. And there is a political debate and a campaign in which this party, this Jewish racist party, which is a mirror image of European anti-Semitic parties, this party is contesting the elections, and as you can imagine, the good guys win. The liberals win, and the Jewish racists are defeated. But I suggest we look at it for a moment. This is a utopian novel. And maybe I'm wrong, but to my memory, this is the only case I came across in a utopian novel when utopia is not so utopian. When Utopia is being depicted, warts and all. When you have a society which is viewed as a model society, but yes, you've got some nasty people there. Those people will be, of course, defeated in a democratic election, but they are there. Herzl had no qualms about saying that there could be Jewish racists just like there are racists everywhere else. Because, if I may quote Azar Berlin, whom we're going to discuss Monday, it was Azar Berlin who once said in a memorable statement, the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. Consider, like everybody else, only more so. So yes, there can be Jewish racism. And there was a time, I don't want to mention any names, but there was a time when Rabbi Geyer in Jerusalem could have been viewed as a model for another rabbi who immigrated to Israel and set up a racist party, Jewish racist party, which was banned in Israel in the 1980s. So there is some prescience here, and there is a realization that those things can happen even in the good Jewish state in the future, but it will be, so they will be defeated. And I mentioned earlier that the whole depiction of this Jewish racist party is a mirror image of European anti-Semitism, more specifically of the anti-Semitic leader and mayor of Vienna at that time, Karl Lueger, who was elected 1895 in democratic elections in Vienna as mayor, and he was anti-Czech, anti-Slavic, anti-Semitic, and was one of the reasons, his election was one of the reasons for Herzl to see the problems faced by Jews in Europe, even under open democratic elections. And the message, by not only suggesting that Arabs have equal rights in Israel, but that this is being challenged, but the challenge is being defeated, is really a message to non-Jewish readers as much as to Jewish readers. Because the idea of the universality of rights, the idea of universal citizenship, irregardless of race, religion, nation, is a European idea. And what Herzl is very subtly or not so subtly saying, those European ideas which were defeated in Vienna, in France during the Dreyfus affair, in Zion they will triumph. And they are the ideas of European liberalism and the idea of the emancipation and the idea of the Enlightenment. So this is the second aspect that I'd like to focus on, and move from here to some aspects of Israel today. But before doing this, let me mention two issues which do not appear in Herzl's Utopia and could be viewed as a legitimate criticism, legitimate up to a point, as you'll see in a moment. Herzl believed that the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine will be an outcome of diplomatic negotiations and an international agreement to which the major powers from England, France, Germany, Russia, and Turkey will be partners. So he believed that the land of Israel will not be won by conquest. He believed, and this was his political Zionism, that it will be negotiated. And he spent most of his time, in the 7 years since the beginning of his activity in the founding of the Zionist organization until his death at the year 1904, when he was 44 years old. I know that all of us think that he was a patriarch. I mean, with his beard, he looked much older. He was a very young man. He died 44. He was age 44. Only through international agreements can a Jewish state be established. And his models were 19th century European nation state in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, which were established sometimes an outcome of war, sometimes not necessarily, but as an international, part of international agreement. And that's why the Zionist Basel program spoke about the aims of Zionism is to ensure the establishment of a Jewish homestead in the land of Israel as part of an agreed public agreement. Herzl was wrong. And he was wrong not because he did not know or see that there were Arabs in Palestine. He was aware, and he suggested, to the best of his liberal imagination and values, equal rights. What Herzl did not see in 1903, and perhaps he should have seen it, but let's check, that there would be, that not only are there Arabs in Palestine, but there will be, or maybe, an Arab national movement which will oppose, and oppose violently, and with some legitimacy, the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This he did not foresee. And I'm saying this is did not foresee, not that he overlooked it, because in 1903 there was no Arab movement in Palestine, and there was hardly any Arab movement anywhere in the Middle East. The Arab national movement was started during World War I as a major force by British intelligence against the Turks. And he was very successful in mobilizing not only Arabs generally, but even the Sharif of Mecca, the leader and the custodian of the two Muslim holy places in Mecca and Medina, against the Turkish Sultan, who was also a Muslim Khalif. This was a major feat of British intelligence and British imperialism. The origins of Arab nationalism are in British imperialism. We should always, it doesn't delegitimize it, but you know, sometimes our Arab friends have to be reminded of that. Herzl did not see it. Perhaps in 1903 he should have seen it. And when you look at some of his notes and his diaries when he visited Egypt in 1903, he makes some interesting comments about the British rule in Egypt and says the Brits think that they can rule Egypt forever, but eventually they're educating an Egyptian intelligentsia which will take over. I mean, he was aware that things are dynamic. But like everybody else in 1903, including socialists. I mean, there is no socialist in 1903 or even 1920 who speaks about Arab self-determination or Indian self-determination. Some of you may recall that in the first Labour-led government in Britain in the 1920s, the minister for India was Sidney Webb, great socialist. It took the socialists some time, until the 40s and 50s, even socialists, to realize that there is a problem here. So here Herzl was wrong. And being wrong on this, he also didn't imagine a situation that Israel will be confronted by war and will live by its sword and will need to have a very strong army. There is in the essay, The Jewish State, a very short passage on the army in the Jewish state, and he says, because the Jewish state will be neutral, ergo it will not have any enemies, ergo it will not need any army, only some sort of border police. Famous last words. I mean, history went in a different direction, and one should realize. Now, I'd like to try, on those two issues that I mentioned, to confront the vision, the Herzlian utopia, with the reality of Israel as it emerged. And the picture is complex, but basically, I would like to say positive, but basically living up, not always to the letter, not always to the detail, but to the principles enunciated by Herzl in Utopia. And the reason for this is not that the founding fathers of Israel in 1948 has read Herzl's Alt-Neuland. Some of them might have, some of them didn't. But the reality and the internal spirit of the Zionist movement went in that direction. Let me start with the issue of equality to non-Jews. In 1948, when Israel was established in the middle of a war, the Declaration of Independence and the first election held to the first Knesset in January of 1949, Israeli Arabs were granted the right to vote, like everybody else. It was based on residence. And Arab Israeli members were elected to the Knesset, some as supporters of the Labour Party, some as members of the Israel Communist Party, which at that time was not as anti-Israeli as eventually the Soviet Union and Israel became. Israel decided in 1948 to keep Arabic as the second official language of the country. Under the British mandate, there were three official languages: English, Arabic, and Hebrew. Of course, English was dropped in a with some very triumphalist speeches. We kicked out the Brits, and we don't need English, etc., etc. Israel kept Hebrew and Arabic as two official languages. You can see it on the Israeli stamps. You can see it on Israeli money. Israeli Arab members of the Knesset have a right to speak in Arabic in the Knesset. All of them know Hebrew, and most of the times they speak in Hebrew. But sometimes when they want to make a point, and they want to speak to their constituency, they can speak in Arabic and there is simultaneous translation. I'd like to see the day when in France, Algerian members of the French National Assembly, there are none, will be able to speak in Arabic in a Republican, laicist, modern France. Not going to happen. Or in Germany, Turks will be able to speak in the very democratic German. German post-1949 is a very democratic country. But speaking Turkish in the German Bundestag, we're not going to see. No. We take those things for granted. As we take for granted the fact that in 1948, Israel decided in its school system to give Israeli Arabs the option of going to state school, not private school, state school that will be teaching in Arabic and whose curriculum will reflect Arab history, the Quran or the New Testament in case of Arab Christians, rather than just Hebrew and Jewish history. Now, I'll say a few words about the way this works, because it doesn't work as nicely as a principle. There are some blemishes on the way this was carried out. But in 1948, Israel could have decided differently. We take it for granted that Arabic was a second language, that Arabs had the right to vote and have the right to vote, and that there would be Arab language schools. In 1948, Israel could have decided, and there would have been an enormous majority for it, if the leaders of the country would have decided, or if the political climate of the country would go in this direction. They could have decided in 1948 that since there is still a war going on with the Arab countries and with the Palestinians, so long as the war is going on, Arabs don't have a right to vote. It would have been a very nasty decision, but it's not out of the possibility to make such a decision in a war situation in 1948. Israel decided not to. Israel could decide that there's going to be only one official language. Yes, there's an Arab minority, but they have to learn the language of the land, which would be exclusively Hebrew. This is what most democratic countries do, and I don't have to tell you that it took some time in Canada to have equalization of the two languages, and probably you still don't have it. Or you do, I don't know. Depends. We're in Ontario, I'm not going to say that. Israel could have decided that there's going to be one state school, like in Republican France, where everybody will be taught to be an Israeli citizen, regardless of his background. If his parents want to teach him Arabic, private schools. but nothing of the country. Israel could have decided differently. It did not. Because the ideas that I mentioned regarding to Herzl were embedded not just in one novel, but were embedded in the way of the self-understanding of Zionism. Does it mean that it works perfectly? It doesn't. I mentioned Arabic as a second official language in Israel. It is. Is an Israeli Arab citizen really equal when it comes to contact with the bureaucracy? According to law, every document has to be published in Hebrew and Arabic. He can apply to the authorities in Arabic. He can testify in court in Arabic. In many cases it happens, in some cases it doesn't. I mean, reality is not perfect. The fact that there are schools in Arabic, state schools in Arabic, is something which we would call, multiculturalism. I mean, I'm bringing colds to Newcastle. I mean, multiculturalism in Canada. Don't say multiculturalism in Israel because everybody would say, this is terrible. But we have a multicultural reality. When you have state schools in 2 languages, you have 2 official languages, you have 2 different curricula, you have multiculturalism, not by the name, because the name is frightening a lot of Jews. But the reality is there. Now, does it mean that if you have schools in Arabic, the curriculum really gives equal weight to an Arab point of view vis-a-vis in his Jewish Israeli point of view in a situation which is a war situation? No. Too many people in the Ministry of Education who decide upon the curriculum in the Arab schools are Israeli Jews rather than Israeli Arabs. Arab schools are underfunded when you look very carefully at budgets, etc., etc. So, and things may be changing, some of them are changing, some of them are not changing. But the principle that Israel is a Jewish nation state which respects not just the individual rights of its non-Jewish citizens, but also their collective cultural rights, is embedded in Israeli reality without Israel having a constitution. It would be very difficult to constitutionalize those rights given the political climate in Israel, but they exist in reality. Again, not perfect. The underfunding of schools, the question of the curriculum are issues which are not yet solved, but it is there. And as a consequence of that, you have a political climate in Israel where Arab parties in Israel, and we have in the Israeli Knesset a communist party, mainly Arab. We have a nationalist Palestinian Arab party, and talking about people who are Israeli citizens, not talking about the occupied territories. We have a fundamentalist Islamic party, which is legal in Israel. May come as a surprise to you. It controls some cities like al-Fahim, the second largest Arab city in Israel, is controlled by a town hall which is run by Islamic fundamentalists. Well, not exactly great lovers of Israel, not involved in terrorism, but using the vehicles of democracy, human rights, the Supreme Court, in order to make their point. And sometimes they make it, and sometimes they make a lot of Israeli Jews very angry, and this is how it should be. Because this is what minority-majority relations are. Somebody has to be angry. I mean, tolerance has to do with suffering. Tolerate. I mean, you are angry at what the other is telling you. That's it. That's what it is all about. On the second issue, which is mutualism, social order, I would say that the Israeli record is much more problematic than that on the rights of Israeli Arabs. Not from the very beginning. But in the last few years, we have seen developments which I think made Israel much less close to the ideal of a third way, mixed economy, than it was when it was before. Because Israel started in terms of its social arrangements. And one could say this really preceded the establishment of Israel. The Jewish community in Palestine, with the kibbutzim, with the moshavim, with a very egalitarian system of remuneration, not equal wages, but a very egalitarian wage and salary system, with a very wide network of social services, medical insurance. Israel in the 50s and 60s was a shining city on the hill for many social democrats and liberals all over the Western world. It is even said, and I'm not sure this is true, and I'm not sure I should quote that person, that when he still wasn't prime minister or president of Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich, coming to Israel, was shown a kibbutz, and he said, this is what we tried to set up in Russia. We failed, you succeeded. Now, I'm not taking his word as the criterion, but I mean, you had something which certainly social democratic parties, never mind Russian communists, but social democratic parties in Sweden, in Norway, British Labour Party people viewed as a model. And it was. In the last years, some of this welfare state system, based on solidarity, because this is what mutualism is, has been replaced by something which is much more modeled on a Reaganite or Thatcherite, rather wild market competitive system. And it is this establishment of some of the institutional arrangements of the Israeli welfare state, when it comes to medical insurance, when it comes to equality, when it comes to social payments for families, etc., that is responsible for some of the social gaps that anybody who is aware of what's happening in Israel today has to notice. Not that Israel was a totally egalitarian society, it never was, but it was a society where it had an ethos of egalitarianism. And even if this egalitarianism sometimes needed a lot of things in order to be truly effective, people were sometimes ashamed when they were confronted with situations of social injustice, where with an unequal system of wages. This is not so the case. The stock exchange, the businessman, the investor, the speculator are today the national hero. Well, I would say until last week, are today the national heroes of Israel. Not the pioneer, not the kibbutznik, not even the soldier. Here we have seen a regression. And when you ask me, looking at the future, what are the major challenges for Israel? The one challenge which I did not mention because everybody else is talking about is obviously trying to achieve peace with our neighbors, trying to achieve mutual acceptance, trying to make it easier for Israeli Arabs to live in Israel in a Jewish state, of which they are and should be equal citizens, and with which they should identify. During the war of 1956, the Suez-Sinai War, an Israeli Arab poet, that member of the left-wing Mapam party, left-wing socialist party, Mahmoud Abbas, not a relation of Mahmoud Abbas, wrote a poem that starts with a very moving line in which he said, "My country is at war with my people." My country being Israel, because he viewed himself as a loyal citizen of Israel, is at war with my people. My people being the Arab people of which I am a part. Not exactly double loyalty, but an inner tension which I think we as Jews should understand and certainly respect and try to minimize when it comes to the other. Another Israeli Arab writer who has lived now in the United States for many years, Anton Shamas, wrote a novel in Hebrew many years ago. It was also translated into Arabic, called Arabesque, which in beautiful Hebrew suggests the ambivalences of the identity of an Israeli Arab who is Israeli, Arab, communist, and Christian. I mean, how many complex identities in one person, which is exactly what Anton Shamas was coming from. And he was interviewed on Israeli radio or TV, I don't remember, I think TV, by an Israeli commentator. I don't want to mention his name, you'll recognize him. And in a very friendly way and in a very appreciative way, not critical despite the fact that a lot of the things in the novel are very critical of the Jewish majority in Israel. And then he asked him, the Israeli Jewish commentator, interviewer, asked Anton Shamas, "Anton, why did you write it in Hebrew? Why didn't you write it in your language, in Arabic, and we would have translated it into Hebrew?" And then Anton Shammas answered me, you think you own the language? Now, that's something which a lot of Jewish writers, I guess from Heinrich Heine to Mordechai Rickler, could have said, do you own the German language? Do you own the English language? We are part of that. All of a sudden, this was thrown in our face, and some Israeli Jews were humbled, and I think chastised by that answer, which was exactly the answer that should have been given. You own the language. This is the language of all the citizens. Don't put me in this linguistic ghetto. You are Arab, you write in Arabic. We will translate you. No, you write in Arabic. Now, on these issues, Israel should do much more than it has done, and I think it has failed. Some of it has to do with a war situation. One has to recall without justifying anything, because a lot of injustices have been done to Israeli Arabs, and a lot of things were neglected. But one has to understand that the position of Israeli Arabs is not just a position of a national minority in a nation state. This is not like Basques in Spain, or South Tyroleans or North South Tyroleans in Italy, or whatever. This is a situation of a minority in a nation state when the nation state is at war with the cultural nation to which the national minority belongs. This is not majority-minority netto. You have here another ingredient. This minority, by its very nature, feels some sort of linkage with the majority Arab world around it, at which Israel is at war. And therefore, normalizing, equalizing the position of Israeli Arabs is also dependent on the peace process. And so long as we're not going to have either a peace process which works or a relative development towards de-escalation, which may take years but will go in the right direction, the position of Arabs in Israel is and will remain problematical for the Arab minority and problematical for the Jewish majority, and we should be aware of the problematic and try to address it. This is not something that can be just pushed under the table, under the carpet, saying, well, we are at war and therefore there's nothing to be done. The ingredients are there. Official language, Arabic, schools, equality in terms of voting, but there are a lot of other things which have to be carried out. I mentioned underfunding, school curricula, etc. I am much more worried, I have to admit, on the second issue. And this is the issue of social justice, social gaps, and the social structure. Because there have been people in Israel, and again, I don't want to name names, but I'm sure you recognize the names. One of them, a former Minister of Finance, who has a very good American background, I'm not mentioning names, who made market fundamentalism into the new ideology of Israel. Now, he didn't invent market fundamentalism. This is Milton Friedman, this is Margaret Thatcher, this is Reagan. I mean, this has been, as I said until last week, the conventional wisdom of the democratic West in the last 20 years. But this was introduced in Israel. The Labour Party in Israel did not put up a real fight against it. Some of its leaders, again, not naming names, but starting with the present president, who is not a member of the Labour Party anymore, also adopted it as saying this is the wave of the future. And it's not just that there are fewer members of people in kibbutzim. It's not just that kibbutzim aren't anymore the shining city on the hill, which is a model for all Israeli society, including those who would never like to spend a day in the kibbutz because a little conformist and difficult, etc. But it was a model. Today the models are somewhere else. Privatization became not an instrument, which sometimes is the right instrument and sometimes gives you the right kind of answer, because not everything should be done by the state, not everything should be done by bureaucracy. But per contra, you shouldn't have any ideology that said nothing should be done by society, nothing should be done by the state, everything should be left in the hands of the market and competition and individuals. We have to redress that balance. And one of the major problems that faces Israel, and with this I'm going to conclude, is that because we are so very much involved with the conflict, because the news from Israel is mainly about the conflict or peacemaking, and peacemaking is the other side of the coin of the conflict, that dealing with the internal issues of social justice has been pushed to the back burner. Until 1948, and in the first 10 or 20 years when Israel went through enormous challenges, maintained a democracy under enormous difficulties, and succeeded, not much innovation has been done in Israeli social structures. The elements of social justice, mutualism, so to speak, Israeli social democracy, Israeli social justice, all those instruments were established in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They were not renovated. They were not revisited. They were not reformed because so much of the human capital and intellectual capital of the country was focused on the conflict and on peacemaking. Even words of left and right have changed their meaning in Israel. If you would have come to Israel in the 1960s and asked a person, are you left-wing or are you right-wing? And somebody would tell you, yes, I'm left-wing. And you would ask him or her, what does it mean to be left-wing? The answer, well, you know, I'm for an egalitarian wage system. I'm for a strong state public sector. I'm for the Histadrut. I'm for the kibbutzim. I'm for the moshavim. And if you would ask a person on the right, you are a person of the right, and what does it mean? He would usually say, well, I'm for more competition. I don't like the Histadrut monopoly. I think the kibbutzniks are getting too much of the national cake. And I like to see greater competition and greater wage differentials. In other words, the answer of what it means to be left and right would be on the axis of the usual right-wing divide in Western democracies, which is in socio-economic terms. When you come today to Israel and ask people, are you right-wing and left-wing, people would still say, yes, right-wing, left. And when you ask a person, are you left-wing? And he says, yes. What do you mean by that? He says, I am for peace with the Palestinians. I'm for going back to the 1967 boundaries. I'm against settlements. I'm for the division of Jerusalem. And if you ask a person of the right, what does it mean? He said, well, I'm for the settlements. I'm for retention perhaps of all of the not Western, Judea and Samaria. And I'm for more settlements, and I'm against the division of Jerusalem. The answer is in nationalistic terms. The social aspect of what it means right and left almost totally disappeared from the public discourse. And if you ask me, because this is Erev Rosh Hashanah soon, what do I wish us? Yes, I wish us peace. I wish us even a government and a stable government. But I would also like to wish us, in order to be true to the Zionist legacy, in order to be true in a way to the vision and utopian vision of Herzl, to reopen the social discourse, to make social issues brings them back to the center of the public discourse, to make the Minister of Labor and the Minister of Social Work and the Institute of National Insurance, Bituach Leumi, into the mainstay of what they have been for many, many decades in Israel, instrument of social justice. We have neglected them because so many things were happening in war and peace. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Avineri will take a few questions, and please approach the microphone if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Something is wrong if everybody agrees with me. Okay? Okay?
Am I allowed 2 questions for the price of one?
Okay, let's hear the first one. And then
They're both on different dimensions. One
Please.
has to do with
To
the
the mic.
diaspora. One has to do with the diaspora relationship of Jews with Israelis. The other one has to do with your assessment of what factors have changed the climate from the kind of universal or egalitarian to the more individualistic, self-serving factors.
Okay.
That's the first question. The second
No,
question.
I saw this one already, two questions. Diaspora, Israel, and egalitarian. Okay, okay.
Okay, because I'm going to sit down.
Okay.
The second question, and I hope I'm not opening up any wounds here. My experience has been in Toronto. I was born here, but I've heard it often said that there is a great divide between Israelis living in the diaspora, and I'll be specific, living in Toronto, and the Jews who were born and brought up in Toronto. I was curious about the characteristic that you mentioned about the idea of a state being developed on the basis of an idea. Would that have anything to do with the differing points of view that we bring towards how we think society should operate?
No, I'm not sure I really got it right in your second question. The division or the distinction between what kind of Jews are Israelis?
I'm talking about Jews born, living, Western, with diaspora Jewry, as against Israeli Jewry that moves into, let's say, a place like Toronto for reasons.
You're talking about the Yordim. You're talking about
We're
the people
talking about the Yordim.
Oh,
exactly.
okay, let's.
Okay, those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Fine. Now, as I said, I think there's three questions here. I mean, your first question was, what were the reasons, really, for those changes? And I think one can see quite a number of reasons for those changes. And one should enumerate them, and I'm going to mention some of them. I'm not going to grade them, which one is the first or second. In a very paradoxical way, some of those changes are the unintended consequences of Israeli successes. Israel is a normal society. People live a normal life in Israel. If people live a normal life in a country, they are less pioneering, they're less involved in solidarity, they want the good life for themselves and their families, and this is also very normal. Maybe we overdid it, but I mean, this is part of normalization. If Israel would have been still a poor country, fighting for its existence in an existential way, which it is not now, because we are a society which is safe and strong and secure, despite a lot of dangers. I'm not minimizing the dangers. If Israel would be still living on the level of on which we were in the 1950s or 60s economically, maybe it's easier to have solidarity when everybody is poor than to have solidarity when some people are getting rich, and there's a lot of richness developed in the country. So part of it is really part of the success story of Israel. And if Israel would be today as a Puritan society it was in the 1950s, some of them may say, I mean, this is not really so. It shouldn't be so. Relax a little bit. But perhaps not we relaxed, but the political climate just forgot about the idea of solidarity. You say solidarity in Israel today, it doesn't matter. It doesn't resonate much. You say market, you say excellence, you say competition. The Americanization, so to speak, of Israeli society, Israeli discourse, is part also, if you wish, of globalization. I mean, all social democratic parties are in some sort of trouble in the West. Ergo, also the Israeli social democratic tradition has been in trouble, but perhaps more than others. And perhaps you can argue whether you need a lot of solidarity in a society like France or Great Britain. In a society which is still in the process of nation building, it is very, very important. The second reason for this may have to do with the fact that a country which has successfully, and it's an enormous success story, integrated so many new immigrants, 2 million in the first 2 decades, 1 million Russians in the last decade. Let me just mention it. There is no other country in the world where the number of people who were integrated as immigrants is anything similar in proportional terms to what happened in Israel. I once mentioned to a German colleague we were talking about the problems Russian Jews had initially. Now they're much better integrated than they were in the first few years. And I said to him, you know, you have ethnic Germans coming back from Russia. Imagine you would have 25 million of them. How would Germany deal with them? He said, well, Germany would collapse. I said, okay, that's it. I mean, this is enormous. Now, when you have a very high number of people who are coming here, coming to Israel, with not necessarily Zionist ideas, but just on an existential level, because life for Holocaust survivors in Europe was difficult, life for Jews in Arab countries was made miserable, life in the former Soviet Union was difficult. So they come to Israel because they want to live in a Jewish state, but they have not been, all of them, socialized to the ideas of social justice, Zionism, etc. They just want to have a good life. And Israel was relatively successful in giving them a good life, which is a success story, but there is an opposite side to it. On the question of relations between diaspora and Israel, I don't want to go too deeply into it, but I think we have to realize that it is and should always be a symbiotic relationship in which both sides have to learn from each other, and neither of the two sides should preach to each other. Neither should preach to the other. I'm sure that a lot of diaspora Jews don't like a lot of things which are happening in Israel, and they are entitled to it. Let me assure you, a lot of Israelis don't like a lot of things that are happening in diaspora communities. We're not going to tell you how to organize your communities. You don't like the fact, and I understand it, that Reform and conservative Jews are at a disadvantage in Israel. As an Israeli, don't like it. But maybe I don't like the way you're organizing your synagogues, but that's your business. Maybe I don't like the way that you're organizing your competing organizations, but that's your business. Maybe I don't like the way in which you decide how much money you devote in the United Jewish Appeal, or whatever the name in Canada is, to your own communities and how much is devoted to it, but this is your decision. So we are in a symbiotic relationship where, to my mind, we have to combine solidarity and respect. Solidarity, and Israel has shown solidarity with Jewish communities in distress, not that there were no failures, but I mean, Israel took in not only 1 million Russian Jews, but also a few tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews, whom I do not think the Jewish communities in the West, and being gentle, would be very happy to see around their own communities because they are black. Excuse me for my bluntness. And I understand it. But that's what Israel is for, because it's based on universal Jewish solidarity for the poor and the untrodden and those who do not have another place in the world. But we need also respect in the way in which we have a dialogue. One of the problems in the dialogue between Israel and the diaspora is that I've been in too many Israel diaspora dialogues that I can, more than I can to admit, that it is sometimes an unequal representation. On the Israeli side, you have in many cases Israeli intellectuals, academics, writers. On the diaspora side, not always, but in the case of the United States, it's a little bit different in Canada as far as I know, but in the United States, what you have on the American side are very few intellectuals, very few of the hundreds and thousands of American Jewish academics and professionals. You have the machers of the various organizations. The executive director of one of the 55 members of the Conference of Major American Jewish Organizations. It's very important to have them, but I would like to see more on the American side, and also the Canadian side, or the French side, or the English side, some of the intellectuals, because there are so many Jewish intellectuals active in Jewish life and in the life of their societies, also dialoguing with Israel. I'm not sure I can answer your third question. You refer to Israelis who left Israel or came from Israel and live in Toronto. I don't know this community. What?
It wasn't a question, it was an example.
That what? Okay, example of what?
Of the disparity in the perception of when you mentioned that the ethos, the background, the historical ethos
Nobody
of
can hear
Israel.
you, miss. You have to speak in the mic. Nobody can hear you.
The point I was making is you started initially, I think one of your first points was the example of countries that have been started with an idea as against historical development regionally, geographically, and so on and so forth, and that Israel was one of those countries. Would that color their point of view? I don't want to be too superficial or dismissive. That they grew up.
Okay,
in Israel.
now I think I
don't
begin
have
to understand the question.
We don't have, as Canadians, a sense of solidarity.
Okay, I think I begin to understand the question. Thank you. Obviously, people leaving Israel for all kinds of reasons, and I call them Yodim because they are Yodim to my mind. I respect the choice because people are entitled to the choice, and there is no great difference between people who decided to leave Israel today and people who decided to leave Israel 2,000 years ago, and most of us are their descendants. So, we are a nation of Yodim. However, people who decide to leave Israel have by necessity an ambivalent attitude to Israel. Ambivalent, I'm not saying anti, but ambivalent. You know, they eat Israeli food, they listen to Israeli TV, they think they live in exile somehow, but they live here. On the other hand, they have also an ambivalent attitude to diaspora Jews because their experience is different. This is a very different community. And this ambivalence is in the nature of the beast. I mean, people who have lived in Israel, decided to leave Israel and live here, are different from Israelis who decided to stay in Israel and live in Israel, and obviously different from people who grew up here. It's only natural. Does it mean that one has to agree with one group or another? I believe in dialogue and I believe in listening to the other, but it's natural that they are different. Thank you. Yes?
Yes, Professor Abineri, I believe Herzl did not foresee the rise of the Haredim because of their huge birth rate, the rise of the ultra-Orthodox Jews and their extortion tactics in Israel today. And let us recall that the Haredim have a deep hostility, a very deep hostility towards the Goyim. They believe women are second-class citizens. They're opposed to secular education.
I think we know what the Haredim is. What's the question?
But maybe the audience doesn't know. They don't read Haaretz and they don't
Well, I know what the
question.
No, please. What is the question? I know what Haredim is. All of us know. What's the question?
In general, they are opposed to Zionism, and since they're growing at a very large rate, what do you foresee as the future of the Haredim in Israel? Haredim are similar to the Israeli Arabs. Both are opposed to Zionism. So, how do you foresee?
Okay. Well, I do not. Okay, thank you. Well, I do not know whether Haredim oppose Zionism or not, but I know that Haredim live in Israel. Haredim live in Israel, and they're Israeli citizens, and they vote for the Israeli parliament, and they're part of my people in Israel. I happen to disagree with them. I mean, you know, I'm not Haredi. I hope you don't suspect it. So. If I hear an echo in your voice that the Haredim are a danger to Israel, okay, you know, if you're concerned about the power of the Haredim in Israel, why don't we organize 500,000 conservative Reform Jews coming to Israel? And this will obliterate the political power of the Haredim overnight. Charity begins at home. No, I'm not preaching Aliyah to anyone. But if one is concerned about those things, I mean, there's something one can do. On the other hand, Herzl's attitude, and very briefly because this is late, Herzl's attitude to religion was much more complicated than sometimes it's being represented. There is a quote from Herzl which appears always, Shula Aloni always gives this quote, and the quote is there, but there are other quotes as well. The quote is that we will keep our rabbis in the synagogues just as we keep our army in I see you recognize it, okay? As we will keep our army in the barracks. Beautiful. But Herzl, being a smart person, never decided to define who is a Jew. Because I think he realized, not that he foresaw it, that anybody who tries with definitions is going to end up with trouble. Because it's very difficult. There's not one definition. But he made the point that we are a people defined by our religion. He didn't say that we are a people by our religion, defined by our religion. That you can be a secular Jew, but the religion of which you are secular is a Jewish religion. It's not a Christian or more. No, this is not funny. This is serious. So there is a very complex attitude. Herzl also wanted to make sure that in the First Zionist Congress there would be rabbis. He even believed that the rabbi of Sadegora, of whom he heard a lot, can become the sort of he almost said the Pope of the Jews. And he even said to his people that in the First Zionist Congress you should leave room in the first row for rabbis if they come, because they photograph very well. I mean, and this may come as a surprise to you. When you read Alt-Neuland, and I didn't go into all the chapters, there is a very moving, but indicative description of Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, because the voyagers come to Jerusalem Friday afternoon, and the city is bustling, but then sometimes afternoon, things begin to quiet down, and the shops are closed down Friday afternoon, and everybody goes back either to his Shabbat meal at home or to a synagogue. Well, very pluralistic. Not everybody goes to a synagogue, God forbid. I mean, so. And this will come as a further surprise to you. In Herzl's Alt-Neuland, the temple is being built, the third temple. And he says, the time has come. It is not very clear in the geographical description where exactly the temple is built. It is clear it's not built on the place of these mosques, because the mosques exist. And what is a temple? When you look at what the temple is, it looks like a modern synagogue to him. No animal sacrifices. But when you enter the temple, this is Herzl writing, there are the two columns, Yachin and Boaz. Herzl not very knowledgeable, says Yachin and Boaz. And the copper Yam HaNechoshet, the copper sea, as it was in Solomon's day, because the time has come. The service there looks like a service in a, not Reform, but in a modern synagogue in Vienna, 1895. I mean, there is music, but not not an organ. It's violins. But there's music. Men and women sit separately. There is a choir. You can see there is a respect to religion, respect for religion, which is not that of a militant secularist. It is a respect of a religion of a 19th century liberal who is not religious himself, but respects religion, which is exactly what 19th century liberals were. They were not religious themselves in practice, but they respected. They were not militant anti-clericalists. We have time for one or two more. If we can have two questions together, if you don't object, okay.
So I'm wondering on what basis you feel Israel should be judged. Should it be judged like any other country, or should it be judged, as I'm following from the speech, based on Alt-Neuland, an imagined utopia? And as such, does that mean that Israel is subject, because of its Zionist history, to a double standard, a higher standard, a standard that it's perhaps set for itself? And do we have any problems with this if it is held to a higher standard than other countries, countries that aren't formulated on, on an ideational platform?
Well, I have another question. And you mentioned that Herzl was for equal rights to the Arabs, and he didn't foresee Arab nationalism. What I would like to know is, if you have an opinion, if you know, what did he think about the most crucial problem, which I think has to do today, is to whom belongs Palestine? Does it belong to the Jews, or does it belong to those who live in the country? And because this is today, all Zionists believe that the country is ours. Those who want to give up some think it because of pragmatic issues, pragmatic problems, we have to give up some. But still, we give up something which is totally ours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not going to quarrel with the way in which you suggest that Zionists believe today or not. The question is not to whom the country belongs. Herzl was very much aware that the country at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. So in terms of international law, international politics, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, right? There was no Arab country there, no Arab state. And he hoped, and he was frustrated in his hope, that he can negotiate either directly with the Sultan or indirectly through international will, that the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, will either lead or cede the country, political control of the country, to the Zionist organization. Herzl also very clearly believes, and that's why I have a problem with your term belonging. Belonging is a property issue, private property. Herzl was very much aware that the land, the physical land, belongs to the people who own it, whoever they are. In most cases, it would be Arabs, or Greeks, or Armenians, or whoever. And if Jews would like to settle on the land, they will have to buy that land. That the idea that the Turkish government will give a charter to a Zionist organization does not mean that the Turkish government will give the land, the physical land on which Arab peasants are living, to the Zionist organization. They will have to buy it. So there's a political issue because Palestine was part at that time of the Ottoman Empire. The ones who took it away from the Ottomans were the Brits. And it became British because the British won the war. I mean, it's not nice to say that you cede territory because you win the war. It's totally illegitimate when it comes to Israel and the Golan Heights and the West Bank. I mean, the fact that we occupied it doesn't give us a right of ownership, which is okay. But it gave it to the Brits and the French and everybody else in the world. Let us remember, where we are. So the issue for Herzl is that, yes, you will get a political rights in the country, and when it comes to issues of land, it has to be bought. And in Alt-Neuland, again, there are a lot of stories. This Rashid Bey tells you the story, how his father sold the land to the Jews and made... What then?
I meant the land politically.
Well, okay, I said I don't want to quarrel with you. Land does not belong to anybody. If land belongs, it's because I bought it. What you are aiming at, and this is a serious problem, do you have a claim? And there's no doubt that Jews have a claim to the land, and there is no doubt that Arabs have a claim to the land. And this is the reason why the Zionist movement in 1947, after at least 10 years of a very difficult debate, accepted the compromise of partition. Because we have a claim, and they have a claim. Chaim Weizmann said it very succinctly, I think, to the United Nations Commission on Palestine in 1946, when he made a statement about the Jewish claims to the land, and one of the members asked him, Dr. Weizmann, don't the Arabs have a claim? And he said, yes, they're waiting outside, and you're going to hear from them in a moment, because the issue is not right against wrong, but it is right against right. This was a Zionist idea why partition was accepted. And the tragedy of our situation, the tragedy of the Palestinians has been that in 1947 and for many, many decades, Palestinians and Arabs believe that only they have rights, only they have claims, and the Jews do not have a claim. We have now the beginning of a realization, I'm being careful, a beginning of the realization among some Palestinians that perhaps for pragmatic reasons you have also to accept the claim of the other. Peace will eventually emerge in the area when we're going to have, on the Arab side, the same kind of complex acceptance of the right of the other. This is not easy. It's not easy for many Jews. It's not easy for many Israelis. And the issue is not to whom the land belongs. It's an issue of property rights, who has a claim, and how do you find a solution when you have conflicting claims, which is a typical issue of natural conflict. You have it in Cyprus, you have it in Bosnia, you have it in Kosovo, you have it now in Georgia, you have it all over the place. We're not unique in this sense. We are unique in the sense that one party, us, was ready for a compromise, not all of them. Some of them believe, Eretz Yisrael Hashlema believe differently. After 67, certain things change. But basically, there is a consensus in Israel of a two-state solution, which means that you have to find a way of compromise between the two claims, hopefully on the Palestinian side as well. To your question about the standards by which Israel should be judged. I'm not really prepared for the question. I never thought on it in the way in which you put it. But so my off-the-cuff answer would be, there are really two kinds of standards. There is an internal standard. When somebody who views himself as a Zionist would like to ask himself, how much are we a success story in Zionist terms? The criteria are internal criteria, and I choose, perhaps arbitrarily, Herzl and Neuland. I could have chosen some political platforms. I found this more conducive and perhaps interesting and imaginative. But there are, of course, universal criteria by which Israel as a nation should be judged. And I don't think it should be judged differently from any other nation. One should take it as a compliment if we are judged by higher standards than others. By others. It makes me sometimes angry, but I take it as a compliment. You think we should be better than others? Okay, thanks for the compliment. I don't know whether we can live up to it. But I don't want to be glib on this. I think the issue of being judged by universal criteria means also comparing Israel to other societies which were in a similar situation. I mentioned the issue of language rights, etc., which very few democratic societies are ready to accept on the multicultural level on which Israel is by praxis, not by ideology behaving. Israel has been in the unusual situation in which it has been at war for 50 years and maintained a democratic structure with a lot of problems with the democratic structure. But if I compare us to the United States in World War II, and I compare the way the United States dealt with its population of both Japanese citizens or American citizens of Japanese origin who were put in concentration camps, and we compare it to Israeli treatment in a 60-year situation of war, I think one can give Israel a B+. The United States get not an F, but a minus F. I mean, absolute failure. And the same can be said about other democratic countries. So I'm ready to be judged by universal criteria, but universal criteria are not an abstraction, but universal criteria is, let's take other societies in similar situations, and we come out with some blemishes. Obviously, no society is perfect, and Israel has a lot of blemishes, but given comparable situations and comparable countries, I think we come up not so bad, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it better, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be self-criticizing ourselves both by universal criterion and by the higher standards of Zionist ideation and vision, as I tried to do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your questions, for being here. And again, I thank you both for visiting Toronto, and we hope that you will come again to visit us very, very soon.